Today we're going to talk about how to use ReactJS with hooks. This video is for you if you've never used React, if you haven't used React in a while, or you haven't used hooks in React. What is React? React was started in 2011 by a software engineer at Facebook, and after he spent some time on it, he open sourced it in 2013 at a JavaScript conference. But what really is React? React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. But what's special about it is it's declarative, efficient, and flexible for components for your front end. Why should you use React? Well, it's a library and it's not a framework. And what that means is battery is not included. You have to pick and choose what you want to add into it, and it doesn't really come with much. For example, it doesn't give you routing. It doesn't have anything for global state management if your application becomes big, etc., etc. It has acceptable application performance with little to no tuning. It supports client-side rendering and server-side rendering. Its syntax, what's called JSX, is very readable, and it looks very similar to just plain old JavaScript, so it's really easy to pick it up. Testing is very easy and simple using Jest and Enzyme. It has React Native as a bonus. React is really popular and the community is really big, and what that means is more people are deploying the code, more people are running it locally. And through having this huge community comes benefits of there's many libraries to do a simple thing or something complicated. You've got your choice. And it's easy to get support. So now let's talk about the underpinnings of React and how it really works underneath the scenes, because this is important for us going forward to understand the components we're building. So React has something called component lifecycle, and there's 4 parts of this. The first part is initialization, and this is the phase in which the component's going to start its journey by setting up state and props, and we'll see what state and props mean later. And then comes mounting. Mounting, this is the phase in which React is going to mount its components on the DOM, and what that means is it's really creating and inserting elements into the DOM at this point. And then once your website is actually in the browser and it's in the DOM and the user can see it, it goes through this updation stage. And what that means is when a user clicks and we download some data, and anytime something's happening through interactions or events, that we're going to re-render our component, and that's only happening right here. It doesn't go through the entire life cycle again. And then once your component's done, meaning it's not used or you've gone to a different page or it's no longer visible, it goes through unmounting, and that's actually removing it from the DOM and cleaning up some memory for faster performance. Next, React gives you Lifecycle Methods. The first one's going to be called Component Will Mount. And when I say the first one, it's not the first thing that happens. As you can see here, you've got your component, and really the constructor is what happens first. And React has gone through many iterations, and throughout those iterations, they've actually decided they didn't want Component Will Mount anymore, and that you should only use the constructor. But it does exist, and you'll see it in a bunch of code, and that's why I'm talking about it. And what it does is it's executed right before rendering takes place. So right before mounting happens here. And it's only called once. So once your DOM is inserted in, this function is done. Next, once your component's rendered, it's in the DOM, cool. You can have a callback that's going to say, well, okay, now that my DOM's there, I might need to do something. And usually this is for making API calls. So you've put a spinner on the page, you want to go make an API call to fetch some data. Next is component should update. So I have gone through setting up my state, my props, I fetch my API, should my component update. And usually what you do in here is you take old state or old props, you compare differences, and you might do some business logic, but it's really just, is my data the same? Okay, if it is or it isn't, return true or false. True means, let me go ahead and do this whole updation part of the lifecycle method. So I'm not loading anymore, I have my data, let's put it on the page, or I got an error, let me display that to the user. And this is a method strictly to tell React whether it should re-render. If you said true, it's going to call component will update, and this will be code you can run before React re-renders its virtual DOM and puts it in the actual DOM. Then once it's rendered and it's put in front of the user, you have another callback, did update, so you can do something like, for example, you noticed your DOM changed and you want to hide or show something in the DOM. Usually you don't want to manipulate the DOM, but if you notice that it changed and you want to do something, you would do that in here. And then that's it. So you kind of go through this component should update in these two red boxes and the green box and the red. You just kind of go through this a whole bunch while the user's interacting. And then if for some reason a prop changed higher up and your component is no longer needed for the page, or the user closes the browser, or whatever happens to cue your component that it's going to go away and not get rendered ever again, and you want to go through the whole life cycle, not just the updation, it calls component will unmount, and then you can do something to clear up memory, like maybe you want to clear out some state in another component, or maybe you want to send something off to the server before this component goes away. This is your opportunity to do that. Okay, now that we've talked about React phases and the lifecycle methods, it's time to actually view code and talk about hooks versus class components. Before we dive deep into the code, I want to talk about some things that are important to know about hooks. Hooks are new to React 16.8, so if you're on an older version, go check your package.json. You won't be able to use it until you upgrade. Hooks are used for functional components, and they allow you to hook into React's state and lifecycle features, hence the name hooks. Hooks don't work in classes, so you can't pull these hooks and try to use them in some old code. It just won't work. There's two main hooks that we're going to talk about in this video, but there is plenty others. The two we're going to use is called useState and useEffect. Some other ones you might see around are useContext, useRef, useReducer, and then there's a few other ones. And so there's two main things you really need to know about hooks. One is don't call hooks inside of loops. And not just loops, but conditions or nested functions. Instead, you always use hooks at the top of your React component. So just quickly, I've got my functional component here, and it's right at the top. It's not inside of any loops, conditions, nested functions, or anything. That's super important. The other thing that you need to know is that don't call hooks from JavaScript functions either. All right, let's jump into this code here. So let's talk about those lifecycle methods that I talked about earlier and how to use them in a class component versus a hook component. Here you can see I've got a class component. You can see I'm using constructor like I mentioned before instead of component will mount for the reasons I mentioned before. We're going to set up our props. And if you don't know what props are read-only variables that are passed into a React class. And then we have state, and you can tell it's a class component because we're doing this.state. And state is for us to store variables that are only local to this class, and I can manually change them and have my component trigger the updation cycle. So once I'm rendered, you're going to see that my default count should be 0, and I'm displaying that value from state. And when I click a button, what I want to happen is I want to update this state, specifically the count in the state, trigger an updation, and I want to see my state plus 1. So to see this in action, you click it, cool, it updates. And there's not a lot of code here, so you might be thinking, why are hooks better than this? And so let's go ahead and jump over here to the functional based component that uses hooks. You can see I have pulled state from React. This is the hook. This is how you get it into your code. I am declaring a variable, so this is totally different if you compare side by side. This.state count. There is no this anymore. I'm making an array. One is the variable, and the other one is a function I can use to update this variable. And then I'm calling the hook, and I'm passing in a default value. And the HTML is the same, but what's different here is the way we update our state. So you can see I'm calling the React from the class, set state, the count equals itself plus 1. Here is the equivalent. I'm clicking the button, I'm setting count to count plus 1. This is much, much less code to do state. And you'll notice that with functional components in general, but when you add in hooks as well, it is much cleaner. So this is an example of component will mount. Let's go to component did mount. So after my DOM is there, I want to kick something off, normally making an API call. So here's how you do it in a class. I've got my class. You just call component did mount. You can console log or fetch an API and then do your rendering. What does that look like in a functional class with hooks? You have something called useEffect. So before you saw I was pulling in useState. Now I'm doing useEffect. And to have something that's sort of equivalent, and I'm going to say sort of, and I'm going to explain why here. What's happening is this is getting called, it's checking to see if this array that I've got highlighted here has had any changes, and if it has, then execute the code in here. Whereas this is saying, did I update my DOM, execute the code in here. So this is going to get called once and only once. Just like your DOM is only going to get mounted once and only once. Alright, let's jump into component did update. So one thing to know about component did update is it's going to get called when literally anything changes, meaning props or state. So if I click my button up here, state changes, this is going to get executed. If I put this component inside of another component and it changes the props that it passes in, that's going to trigger this no matter what. UseEffect doesn't necessarily have that. You can get it through not passing in the second argument. So if we go back up to didMount, we've got the second argument. You can not pass it in and this will get called whenever anything changes. But it's not exactly the same. And what I mean by that is this only gets executed when props or state changes after component didMount. This is going to get executed on mount and when it gets updated. So there isn't a one-to-one. You can get around this, but there isn't exactly a one-to-one with hooks. Component will unmount. Like I mentioned before, this is when your component is going away and we're trying to clean up because it needs to be deleted. It's very simple inside of a class component, and this is where use hooks gets a little weird. What you have to do is you have to use effect, and then inside of this anonymous function, you want to return another anonymous function that only gets called when your component is unmounting. This is the syntax for component will unmount. So that's enough side-by-side comparison. Let's go ahead and jump into some working code. Alright, so what I've got here is CodePen. Again, I'll put the link to this in the description box down below. What we've got is, I've got a hook version of that code we were talking about before, and then I also have a class version of this. And what we're going to do is, we're going to look at the console logs that are happening here. So first I want to show you the code. We've got a component with a class. It's got a constructor. We're setting up the state. We want to know when it's mounted, when it's getting updated, and when it's unmounting. And we want to see how it is different with hooks. So same HTML, we've got a button, you click it, it updates. So for example. Next, let's look at the hook. Here we've got our state, not in a constructor, it's just getting set up at the top. We've got our lifecycle methods being defined using useEffect. Here, because we have this blank array, this is component didMount, meaning it's only going to get executed once. We've got our component didUpdate, meaning every time props or state changes, this is going to get called. And then we've got our unmount. So let's go ahead and let's look at the console log for what's happening here. So I'm going to go ahead and reload. Okay, you can see a class, it executed the I am mounted only once. That's good, that's what we want. And you can see our HTML is on the page. If I click this, you can see I mounted and I updated. Cool. And then to trigger an unmount, what you need to do is you need to make this go away. We have an app here and we are toggling which component we want to render based on state. So, component will unmount. Let's pull this back open. And to do this, we're going to switch to hooks. You can see, oh, it's unmounted. Now my hooks component is mounted, and it's mounted or updated. What happened here? If we look here, why did this get called? Well, what happens is when you call this function, all these get evaluated, and then let's go ahead and trigger the unmount. So we're going to go back to class. Boom, unmounted. Alright, and that's all for hooks today. Hopefully this super simple example has helped you. If it has, feel free to share this with anybody else who's new to React or wants to see the equivalent of a class-based component versus a functional-based component with hooks. If you have any questions, leave some comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video and you learned something, drop me a like, it helps me out a lot. That's all for now. Hope you all have a great day.